Here is Sailor Studio 642, a very dark blue that almost makes me think this could be a blue-black, when it really is a navy blue in tone. So confusion can be expected a little bit for this. There's no tone variation as the pen or paper change, and it does shade to an almost black from a very dark blue. The swatch matches the writing sample perfectly, which is rarely the case. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this can be aggressive, getting into the paper, but it still shades and doesn't feather. In this case, I just don't care about the aggressiveness on non-fountain pen friendly paper. I mostly write on good paper anyway. I buy my own paper to take my notes with at work just to avoid this type of problem. I like the tone and the shading. I see that I would love to have a bottle of this and to have it in my rotation of my personal writing.
The pen for today is a Pelikan P200. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see just how dark a navy blue we've really got. And it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade to that almost black. It's not impossible to find the dark blue and the almost black. Look at impossible on the first line, where the IM are that very dark blue, but the pass almost really darkens up beautifully. The ibly at the end slightly lightens on the ib, the lee at the end, very dark again. I like what I'm seeing here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, great performance from this ink.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Pesh. Here is Sailor Studio 873. Here is Sailor Grenade. Here is Sailor Soleil.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just like it does on the Clairfontaine, going from that very dark navy blue to an almost black, but it's never actually black, so it does a fantastic job here. Looking at the back of the page, you can find a couple of spots that it got deep into the paper. Now, on the majority, I'm going to say that any ghosting that goes on is really minor considering how dark this ink is. And those spots, for that reason, I might ignore it because on the majority of its performance, it is doing fantastic. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. The fact that there is no tone shift means that this is a very opaque ink. It is not affected by the tone of the paper that you have underneath. A really good thing when you're not always sure what you're going to be writing on. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get to see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. We also get to see that it stands out without any problem against the quad rule, which I would have been shocked if this had any kind of a problem. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue number 1. Here is Noodler's La Couleur Royale. Here is Organic Studios Cobalt Blue. Here is Pilot Konpeki or Cerulean Blue. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. But the shading is still there, as has been discussed before. Look at discussed on the first line, where the dis at the beginning is slightly darker than the cuss in the middle. The ed at the end does get just a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Continue those fantastic notes. And if you're a student using this, I'm going to bump you a whole letter because this is outstanding.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Zenzoi Sweet Pink. Here is Diamine Pumpkin. Here is Roher & Klinger Document Magenta. Here is Pelican Edelstein Golden Barrel. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. This is generally doing incredibly well. I mean, I say it doesn't spread. The spread that's there is so incredibly minor that who cares? This is a great ink if you continuously write on this type of paper. Looking at the back of the page, you could see that you probably wouldn't want to write back here because of the extreme amount of ghosting that's going on. Nothing bled through to touch the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelican P200 has a medium to wet flow medium nib. It gives a consistent tone and a friendly touch of shading throughout. Off camera, I went for a wet broad and it didn't darken. It didn't shade any different. It just gave a it didn't shade. It just gave a very dark, consistent tone throughout all of the writing, making it perfect for someone that doesn't want shading. I, however, really like the way the shading looks. So I go for the medium to slightly wet, medium or fine nib to see the greatness that comes out from this ink in my writing.